Connor Kane was the best in the business, a shadow operative who specialized in high-risk extractions and intel recovery. After 2 decades of slipping through the cracks of geopolitics and black market alliances, he was ready to leave it all behind. His last mission had been a success, the perfect exit for a man who had seen too much. But just as he was settling into his new life in Lisbon, the past came knocking. One night, Kane found a manila envelope slipped under his apartment door. It contained a single photograph, a faded image of him in Sarajevo, taken nearly 10 years earlier during a covert mission that had gone sideways. That mission was buried under layers of classified files, inaccessible to anyone who wasn't there. Yet here it was, sitting on his doorstep. Beneath it was a handwritten note in code, "Return to Sarajevo. The game is unfinished." That mission, 10 years ago, had been one of the most brutal of his career. His team had been tasked with taking down a Serbian warlord suspected of orchestrating underground arms deals with a mysterious syndicate known as the Revenant Order. But things had gone south, and his entire team had been compromised, barely making it out alive. Kane had always suspected there was more to the mission, something hidden beneath layers of misdirection. He knew that going back to Sarajevo meant opening up a past he had worked hard to bury. Yet he couldn't ignore the feeling that someone wanted him back there for a reason. So, Kane gathered his old equipment, leaving no trace of his departure, and flew out under an alias, slipping through borders as he'd done countless times before. He arrived in Sarajevo at dusk, the city's scars from years of conflict still visible against the skyline, reminders of old wars and unresolved secrets. Almost immediately, Kane sensed he was being watched. Shadows lurked in alleys, eyes followed him in reflective surfaces, and small, seemingly harmless encounters felt charged with hidden meanings. He knew he was walking into a trap, but he was ready for it. Years of honing his instincts kicked in as he prepared for whatever lay ahead. His first stop was an old cafe, a place he and his team had used as a safe house years ago. As he slipped into a corner booth, a waitress slid him a cup of coffee along with a folded note. He glanced at it. "Meet me at the ruins. Midnight. Alone." The signature was unmistakable, Sofia Markovic, his handler from that ill-fated mission. Sofia had disappeared shortly after the operation, and no one had seen her since. Rumor had it she'd gone rogue, or worse, been taken out by the Revenant Order. If she was alive, she was his best chance to find answers. At midnight, Kane made his way to the ruins of an old fortress on the outskirts of the city. The silence was thick, the only sound being his own footsteps echoing across the stone. In the moonlight, he saw a shadow move, and a woman stepped into the faint light, Sofia, older but still sharp, her eyes colder than he remembered. "Kane," she said, her voice steady. "You shouldn't have come back." "You called me here, Sofia," he replied, his tone measured. "I want answers. What happened that night? Why was my team sacrificed?" Sofia looked away, her jaw tightening. "Because we were all pawns. The Revenant Order had agents everywhere. They'd infiltrated high-ranking government agencies, military, intelligence networks, all of it. That mission in Sarajevo was never about stopping the arms trade. It was about eliminating anyone who got too close to uncovering the Order's real agenda. And that was?" Kane pressed, a chill running down his spine. "They were developing a weapon, a device that could disrupt all digital and communication systems within a 100-mile radius. They called it the Eclipse. Imagine the power to shut down an entire country's infrastructure in seconds. That's what they were after." Kane's mind raced. He'd heard whispers of the Eclipse, a rumored weapon that could change the balance of global power. But he'd assumed it was just that, a rumor. Now, it seemed terrifyingly real. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. Sofia hesitated, glancing around as if someone might be listening. "Because they've found a way to activate it. They're going to use it as leverage, and if they succeed, they'll control every government that relies on modern tech. I managed to steal part of the activation code. That's why they're hunting me. And you. She handed him a flash drive. This is only part of it. The other half is hidden in the city, and they're closing in on it. Before Kane could respond, the faint hum of approaching vehicles interrupted them. The ruins were suddenly flooded with headlights, and figures emerged from the darkness, Revenant agents, dressed in black tactical gear, weapons aimed at them. The trap had been sprung. Kane, go! Sophia yelled, drawing her gun and firing off shots to cover his escape. Without hesitation, Kane bolted, sprinting through the labyrinth of ruins as bullets whizzed past him, cutting through the night. He knew he had to disappear. The Revenant Order was too powerful to confront head-on, and if he wanted to survive, he had to outsmart them. He found an old tunnel that led to the edge of the city and slipped into the shadows, disappearing into Sarajevo's winding streets. He knew the city well enough to evade capture, but he was only a step ahead. He spent the next few days moving like a ghost, blending into the city's underbelly, reaching out to old contacts, and piecing together clues to locate the hidden half of the activation code. Meanwhile, he kept his senses sharp, always aware of the agents patrolling nearby. The Revenant Order had eyes everywhere, and each night he found himself forced to relocate, narrowly escaping their grasp. After days of searching, Kane found himself at a forgotten bunker beneath the city's old library. It was abandoned, dark, and silent, with walls covered in encrypted symbols. His contact had said this was where Sophia had hidden the second half of the code. Using a flashlight, Kane deciphered the symbols, each one a part of a larger puzzle that eventually led him to a hidden compartment in the wall. Inside, he found a small, dusty USB drive, the missing piece. Just as he pocketed the drive, he heard footsteps approaching. The Order's agents had tracked him down. Kane knew he had no time to waste. In a calculated move, he disabled the lights, plunging the bunker into darkness. He navigated through the shadows, silently taking down one agent after another. The firefight was short and brutal, leaving him breathless but alive. With both parts of the code, Kane had what he needed to stop the eclipse. But he also knew that simply possessing it made him a marked man. He had one final move to make, to broadcast the code, rendering it useless by putting it in the public domain. But to do that, he'd need the help of a skilled hacker. Kane reached out to Sophia, arranging a covert meeting in a high-rise safe house overlooking the city. The skyline was blanketed in fog, lights muted and casting eerie glows across the dark buildings. Sophia greeted him with a grim smile, and together, they connected the drive to her laptop, preparing to transmit the code. As they worked, they heard the sound of helicopters approaching. Revenant forces had tracked them again, and this time, they were bringing everything they had. Time was running out. Just a few more seconds, Sophia said, her fingers flying over the keys. The door exploded inward, and Kane sprang into action, taking down agents as they stormed in, fighting to buy her more time. Finally, she hit enter, and the data began flooding the network, transmitting the Eclipse code to every secure channel in existence. The Revenant Order's most valuable weapon was now public knowledge, useless in the hands of any single party. In the chaos, Sophia and Kane managed to slip out, escaping into the maze of alleys below. As they watched the city's lights fade into the distance, Kane knew he had narrowly escaped with his life. The Order would still hunt him, but they had lost their greatest leverage. For now, the world was safe. As dawn broke over Sarajevo, Kane vanished once more, a ghost on the move, carrying with him the secrets of a war that would never make the headlines. Alex Mercer was a man who left his past behind, or so he thought. 5 years out of the game, he had finally built a quiet life in a small town nestled by the mountains, far from the chaos of his old life as an elite Black Ops specialist. But that peace shattered the day he found an unmarked package on his doorstep. Inside was a simple message: "We remember." The words were written in code, familiar to Alex from his days in covert operations. The memory of his last mission flooded back, the disastrous op in Madrid, a political scandal that almost toppled governments and forced his agency to erase his identity. They'd buried it all to protect him. But someone was digging it up. Overnight, his life turned upside down. His secure phone vibrated with coded messages. His contacts from the old days, people he hadn't heard from in years, were going dark, disappearing one by one. Someone was systematically hunting them down, and Alex was clearly next. Determined to get to the bottom of it, he packed his bags, locking his memories and his weapons away, and hit the road. Every move he made felt like walking a razor's edge. He quickly realized he was dealing with an unknown enemy, a ghostly presence that left no clues but always seemed one step ahead. The deeper he dug, the more he found himself entangled in a secret war involving high-ranking officials, covert technology, and millions of dollars in hidden funds. It was a vendetta that had been brewing since that mission in Madrid, and now, the stakes were higher than ever. His investigation led him to Berlin, where he met an old friend, Natasha, a hacker and former intelligence agent. She had a theory, that whoever was targeting him was after something bigger, the Harbinger Protocol, a classified project that Alex had only heard whispers of. Said to be a cyberweapon capable of disabling entire infrastructures, it was designed as a last resort in global warfare. If it fell into the wrong hands, it could cripple cities, entire countries. Natasha hacked into restricted networks, retrieving files and piecing together the web of connections. Together, they uncovered clues linking government officials, private arms dealers, and rogue military officers all tied to a shadow organization known as the Black Mantle. But before they could act, Natasha's systems were hacked, her hard drive wiped clean. An ominous message flashed across her screen, "We're watching." Without wasting a second, Alex knew it was time to move. He and Natasha went off the grid, switching vehicles, abandoning phones, and using analog methods to communicate. They were playing a high-stakes game against an invisible, lethal opponent who knew how to leverage every digital trace. The chase took them across Europe, from abandoned bunkers in the Alps to safe houses in old cities, each place hiding encrypted files and dead drops left by the operatives who had come before them. As they unraveled the puzzle, Alex discovered that the Black Mantle had been orchestrating his betrayal from the start. They were behind the botched Madrid operation, the loose ends, the abandoned agents. The Harbinger Protocol was not only real, it was the last piece they needed for a global takeover. And now, they knew Alex was onto them. A final message came through, forcing their hand, "Meet us in Prague." Alone. Alex knew it was a trap, but it was his only chance to stop them. With Natasha providing cover from a distance, he arrived at the rendezvous in an abandoned cathedral under the cover of night, his senses on high alert. Shadows moved around him, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing across the cold stone floor. His old handler, a man he hadn't seen since the Madrid disaster, stepped out of the darkness. "Alex," he said with a slight smile. "I was hoping you'd show." Behind him stood a dozen operatives, each armed, each with eyes locked on him. They'd been waiting, knowing that Alex's loyalty to the truth would lead him here. "What's the protocol's endgame?" Alex demanded, his voice echoing off the stone walls. His handler's smile only widened. "Control, Alex. The kind we were always meant to have. Your little crusade ends here." But Alex had prepared for this. In a calculated move, he triggered a signal to Natasha, who had hacked into the building's power grid. With a single keystroke, the lights went out, and in the cover of darkness, Alex moved. Years of training took over as he disarmed and disabled one operative after another, using the shadows to his advantage. By the time the backup power kicked in, the room was littered with bodies, and Alex stood alone, his handler held at gunpoint. "It's over," Alex said, his voice steady. "You don't understand," the handler whispered, defiance in his eyes. "You can't kill an idea. Black Mantle isn't just me. It's everywhere." Without another word, Alex pulled the trigger. There would be time to deal with the Black Mantle's network later. For now, he had bought the world a few precious moments of peace. As dawn broke over the Prague skyline, Alex disappeared into the crowd, a ghost once more, but this time, he was the one with the upper hand. Ethan Cross had never seen his life flash before his eyes so many times in a single night. His pulse hammered as he raced down the narrow, dimly lit street in the back alleys of Belgrade, his heart thudding against his ribs. He didn't know who they were, or why they'd been following him for the past 2 days, but one thing was certain, they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted, and from the look in their eyes, what they wanted was his head. It started as a regular intel-gathering mission. Ethan was a covert operative, highly trained and deadly, with years of experience navigating complex international operations. He'd been tasked with gathering information about an underground weapons cartel that had been moving large quantities of advanced arms technology through Eastern Europe. The briefing was standard, the target clear. But he hadn't expected a shadow operation to tail him as he moved in to meet his contact at the crumbling warehouse by the Danube. Now, all that was left was the adrenaline pounding through his veins and the fear crawling up his spine as his instincts screamed for him to run. Every corner he turned only led to more dead ends. He'd been in situations like this before, but something about tonight was different. His gut told him he was dealing with pros. These people weren't just mercenaries or hired muscle, they were trained, precise, ruthless. Ethan's footsteps echoed on the cobbled pavement as he darted past an old market, now dark and empty, its heavy iron gates rattling in the cold midnight breeze. The only sound was the faint patter of rain, mingling with the distant roar of the river. But he knew better than to assume he was alone. A flash of movement at the edge of his vision made him spin, just in time to dodge a silent knife swipe aimed at his throat. The attacker's face was masked, his eyes a steely blue that held no mercy. Ethan countered, blocking the second strike and twisting the assailant's arm with practiced ease. But before he could finish him off, a gunshot rang out, the bullet ricocheting off the metal container beside him. He rolled away, taking cover behind a stack of old crates. They were closing in. He quickly scanned the area, calculating his next move. The shadows moved with silent purpose, the trained footfalls of multiple operatives approaching from every direction. Whoever they were, they had the manpower and firepower to surround him easily. He was outgunned, outnumbered, and, judging by the subtle clicks and murmurs over their radios, up against a highly synchronized team. He had seconds to act, and the consequences of staying here too long were a bullet in the head or worse. With a flash of desperate inspiration, he grabbed a metal pipe lying nearby and hurled it across the alley, hitting a stack of crates with a loud clang. His attackers shifted their focus, moving towards the noise. It was all the distraction he needed. He sprinted towards the fence at the far end of the alley, jumped, and scrambled over the top, cutting his hands on the rusted barbed wire. The pain was sharp, grounding him, but he had no time to dwell on it. He dropped down on the other side, his feet hitting the ground just as the sound of boots grew louder behind him. Ethan didn't stop. The only chance he had now was to lose them in the winding streets and alleys of the old city. His mind raced as he calculated his next steps. He had to get to a secure line, contact his agency, and figure out who these people were. The intel he was carrying was highly sensitive, blueprints for a new biochemical weapon that a terrorist cell was attempting to develop. If it fell into the wrong hands, it could mean mass casualties across Europe. For the first time in his career, Ethan felt a shiver of fear crawl up his spine. The files he was carrying weren't just any ordinary intelligence, they were the kind that could destabilize governments, the kind that powerful figures in the shadows would kill to possess. He navigated the maze of Belgrade's old streets, taking every turn he could, hoping to lose his pursuers. But the sounds of footsteps grew closer. He ducked into an old, abandoned building, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. The air was thick with dust and decay, the faint smell of mildew clinging to the walls. He pressed himself against the wall, controlling his breathing, listening. Outside, the footsteps slowed, methodical, as if they knew he was nearby. Ethan slid his hand to his belt, where he kept his backup Glock. It wasn't much against an entire squad, but it would have to do. He raised it, ready to fire at the first sign of movement. The seconds ticked by, stretching into a tense eternity. Then he heard it, a faint scrape of a boot against concrete, just outside the doorway. He held his breath, finger on the trigger, waiting. The figure entered, gun raised, scanning the shadows. He was one of the same men who'd attacked him earlier. Ethan could see the glint of a knife strapped to his hip, the silent, lethal calm in his eyes. This wasn't an ordinary operative, he was a hunter, and Ethan was his prey. Ethan moved in a blur. He swung his elbow up, catching the man off guard, the gunshot muffled as they struggled. The attacker's reflexes were quick, but Ethan was quicker. In a flash, he had him in a chokehold, cutting off his air. He needed answers, and this was his only chance to get them. "Who sent you?" Ethan growled, tightening his grip. The man's expression remained stoic, his loyalty unwavering. It was clear that he'd rather die than betray his employer. But Ethan had other ways of making him talk. He twisted the man's arm at a brutal angle, eliciting a grimace of pain. "The files. Why are you after them?" The man sneered, his voice a low rasp. "You'll never get out of here alive, Cross. We own this city." Before Ethan could press him further, the man slammed his head back, hitting Ethan in the face and breaking free. He stumbled, blood dripping from his nose, and the attacker took advantage, lunging forward with the knife. Ethan barely dodged, the blade slicing his arm. Ignoring the pain, he twisted, delivering a crushing blow to the man's jaw, knocking him out cold. But the noise had attracted attention. Outside, he could hear the rest of the squad closing in. He had only moments before they found him. Ethan searched the unconscious man's pockets, finding a small, encrypted device. He pocketed it, hoping it would hold the clues he needed. Then, without a second thought, he darted towards the back exit, slipping out into the rain. Belgrade stretched out before him, silent and dark, the city lights flickering like distant stars. He knew he couldn't run forever, but if he was going to survive the night, he'd need to stay one step ahead of whoever was hunting him. And he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The rain had turned into a steady downpour, and the streets gleamed under the dim glow of scattered street lamps. Ethan knew Belgrade well enough to navigate through its labyrinthine streets, but he was running out of time. His attackers weren't just efficient, they were relentless, and from the glimpses he'd caught, well-equipped. These weren't amateurs, they were a highly coordinated tactical team, trained to execute quickly, quietly, and with deadly precision. As Ethan continued down the narrow alleyways, he fought to suppress the growing urgency pressing against his chest. He was used to high-stakes operations, but this mission was different. He hadn't expected to be ambushed, and definitely not by a private team with such sophisticated weaponry. Whoever had hired them had deep pockets and even deeper connections. He mentally cursed as he realized he should have noticed the signs earlier, the near-silent drones shadowing his movements, the subtle changes in local foot traffic around his safe houses. He'd been careless, and now he was paying for it. Ducking into the shelter of a crumbling brick archway, Ethan took a moment to examine the device he'd snatched from his would-be attacker. The screen remained blank, requiring an activation code. He recognized it immediately as an encrypted communication tool, used by high-ranking operatives to relay real-time instructions without risking interception. If he could get it online, it might give him an edge in staying ahead of them. But before he could even consider trying to hack into it, he heard the telltale murmur of voices approaching, punctuated by the faint hum of an engine. A sleek black SUV rolled down the street, its headlights off, moving as silently as a predator in the night. A flash of lightning revealed the silhouettes of three men with military-grade rifles, scanning the area with night vision goggles. They weren't leaving anything to chance. Ethan pressed himself flat against the damp wall, watching as the vehicle rolled to a stop. His options were dwindling. He could keep running, trying to stay one step ahead, or take a calculated risk. In his line of work, hesitation was fatal. The SUV's doors opened, and the men stepped out, their boots hitting the pavement in perfect synchrony. Two of them moved forward, their weapons at the ready, while the third lingered by the car, speaking softly into a radio. The comms crackled faintly in the damp air, and Ethan caught fragments of their conversation. Sector 4 clear, moving to sweep Sector 5, primary target possibly injured, no sighting since last location. As they spread out, Ethan seized the opportunity. He moved with lethal efficiency, coming up behind the man by the car and pressing a knife to his throat, covering his mouth before he could utter a sound. The man tensed, his hands dropping the radio, but Ethan's grip was unyielding. In seconds, he lowered the man's unconscious body to the ground, dragging him out of sight behind the SUV. One down, but two others remained. Ethan scoured the man's belt and pocketed an additional clip for his Glock. He then retrieved the man's earpiece, carefully fitting it into his own ear. Immediately, the low hum of communication flowed into his ear, punctuated by orders from someone on the other end. Sector 5, maintain visuals. We need confirmation on Cross's location. His suspicions were confirmed, they knew exactly who he was. And if they were tracking his location, it wouldn't be long before they brought in backup. Ethan edged closer to the two remaining operatives, moving from shadow to shadow, his footsteps silent against the wet cobblestone. These men were armed and alert, but they lacked the instincts that only years in the field could hone. He waited until one of them turned, scanning an alleyway, then took his shot. The silenced gunfire barely registered as he dropped the first man. Before the second one could react, Ethan had him on the ground, delivering a quick, decisive blow to the back of his neck. He allowed himself a brief moment to catch his breath, wiping the rain from his eyes. But he knew better than to stay too long. Every passing minute brought him closer to being cornered. As he slipped down another alley, his mind raced back to his briefing 2 days earlier. His mission had been clear: extract intelligence on Dragan Vukovic, an arms dealer with ties to a shadowy syndicate known only as Cryos. Cryos was infamous for its influence, operating in the gray areas of geopolitics, supplying arms and intelligence to the highest bidders without regard for ethics or loyalty. But lately, Cryos had shown interest in biological weaponry, a game-changer in the world of covert warfare. Ethan hadn't anticipated that Cryos would catch on to his investigation so quickly. From what his agency knew, Vukovic was involved in trafficking a new kind of neurotoxin, a chemical agent deadly enough to destabilize an entire city within hours. The thought of that weapon falling into the wrong hands was enough to keep him moving, no matter how bleak his chances appeared. Emerging onto a broader street, Ethan kept his gaze low, blending in with the sparse, late-night crowd that wandered the city. He scanned the area for potential hideouts. A flickering neon sign for a dingy nightclub caught his eye. It would be crowded, loud, and chaotic, exactly the sort of place he could lose himself, if only briefly. He slipped inside, the thump of bass and the chaotic swirl of lights engulfing him. The strobe lights and flashing reds cast shadows across the dimly lit bar and crowded dance floor. The mix of drunken tourists and locals gave him enough cover as he weaved his way to the far side of the club, finding an exit near the bathrooms. In a small, dim hallway by the back door, Ethan found a quiet corner and tried to catch his breath, listening to the muffled beats of the music. He pulled out the encrypted device he'd stolen and inspected it closely. It was a custom model, made by a manufacturer known for creating secure devices for government agencies. If he could find a way to hack into it, he might be able to intercept the orders coming down to the operatives chasing him. He activated a secure link through his smartwatch, attempting a bypass code sequence. The device blinked red, denying access, but he persisted. He knew a trick or two to crack low-level encryption, a perk of working in intelligence for so long. After a few tries, the screen finally flickered to life, and text scrolled across it. Primary target, Cross. Objective, retrieval of intelligence and elimination if necessary. Full discretion advised. Reinforcements en route. Reinforcements. He clenched his jaw, feeling the tension tightening like a vice. There would be no way out if they managed to surround him completely. As he continued scrolling, he noticed the signature at the bottom of the order, Cryo's command, Operative Level 9 authorization. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. This wasn't just any team after him, it was Cryos' elite. Level 9 authorization was rarely granted, reserved only for the highest priority missions, those that couldn't fail. Whoever had issued this order was sending a message loud and clear. Ethan Cross was considered a top-tier threat, and they would stop at nothing to neutralize him. A door swung open, and he tensed, shoving the device back into his pocket as a figure appeared, silhouetted by the hallway's faint light. He recognized her immediately, the woman from the briefing. Her name was Zara Talik, a field operative rumored to be one of the deadliest agents in the region. They'd crossed paths once before in Istanbul, but she'd been on his side then. The look in her eyes told him that wasn't the case tonight. "Ethan," she said, her voice low and unreadable. She tilted her head slightly, observing him with a mixture of pity and regret. "You should have stayed out of this." "You don't know what they're planning," he replied, careful to keep his hands visible and his voice calm. "If they get their hands on that neurotoxin, thousands could die. This isn't just another deal gone wrong, Zara." She regarded him in silence, her expression flickering briefly with something he couldn't read. For a moment, he thought he saw doubt, maybe even sympathy. But she shook her head, her eyes hardening. "It's bigger than both of us, Ethan. They have orders, and we're both just pawns." Without warning, she raised her weapon. Ethan reacted instantly, twisting to avoid the shot, the bullet slamming into the wall behind him. The club's pulsing music drowned out the sound, and no one seemed to notice the skirmish unfolding in the shadows. Ethan lunged forward, disarming her in a swift motion, but she countered with a knee to his ribs, sending him staggering. They grappled, exchanging blows in a brutal, silent dance, each movement calculated, each attack intended to kill. She was good, faster and stronger than he remembered. But he wasn't about to back down. With a quick feint, he grabbed her arm and twisted, pinning her against the wall. "I'm not your enemy, Zara," he whispered fiercely. "Help me stop this before it's too late." She looked up at him, her breathing ragged, her face inches from his. For a split second, he saw something shift in her expression. But before she could respond, the device in his pocket buzzed, and he glanced down, his heart sinking as he read the new message. Final clearance issued. Reinforce with full squad at location. Zara's eyes widened slightly as she read over his shoulder. It began on an unassuming autumn evening. The kind of evening that felt heavy with the promise of something just slightly off. The air, though crisp, carried an uncanny stillness, as if the world was holding its breath. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the sun dipped low, casting a pale orange light over the expanse of the whispering woods. The townsfolk had always been cautious about the woods, with their tall, looming pines and gnarled branches that seemed to claw at the sky. Legends whispered of voices calling from within, luring the foolish or the curious deep into its labyrinth. Some said it was cursed, others swore it was alive. Either way, it had claimed more than its share of wanderers who never returned. But 17-year-old Elena Hastings wasn't one to believe in old wives' tales. A skeptic by nature, she dismissed the stories as the overactive imagination of small-town folk. What she couldn't dismiss, however, was her little brother Toby's disappearance 2 nights prior. Toby, with his unruly mop of chestnut hair and insatiable sense of adventure, had wandered too close to the woods. He'd been playing a game of hide-and-seek with some neighborhood kids when they last saw him. Despite search parties and frantic calls, there'd been no sign of him. The only clue was a single, torn sneaker found just beyond the tree line. Elena stared at the edge of the forest now, clutching the flashlight she'd taken from her father's toolbox. The beam illuminated only the first few feet of trees before being swallowed by the oppressive darkness beyond. Her parents had pleaded with her to leave the search to the authorities, but she couldn't just sit and wait. Not when Toby was out there. "All right, everyone," Elena said aloud, her voice trembling slightly. "If you're watching this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This might be my last video, but hey, maybe it'll go viral." She gave a shaky laugh, the kind that masked fear, and clicked her phone's camera off. The forest welcomed her with an unnatural silence. The crunch of leaves beneath her boots sounded deafening in the absence of chirping crickets or rustling wind. As she ventured deeper, the trees closed in, their twisted trunks and interwoven branches creating an almost claustrophobic effect. "Okay, Toby," she called out, her voice bouncing off the shadows. "This isn't funny anymore. If you're hiding, just come out." A faint sound answered her, a whisper, so soft it could have been the breeze. Except there was no breeze. "Toby," she said again, her pulse quickening. The whisper came again, clearer this time. It wasn't her brother's voice. It wasn't even human. It sounded layered, like 100 voices speaking in unison, their tones ranging from a child's innocent giggle to the guttural growl of something inhuman. "Come closer," it beckoned. Every instinct screamed at Elena to turn back, but the thought of Toby trapped and alone outweighed her fear. Gritting her teeth, she pushed forward, deeper into the woods. The terrain grew uneven, the ground slick with damp moss. Her flashlight flickered ominously, casting erratic beams that made shadows dance in ways that didn't feel entirely natural. At one point, she tripped over a root and landed hard on her hands and knees. Wincing, she picked herself up, brushing dirt from her jeans. That's when she saw it, a trail of small footprints leading deeper into the forest. "Toby," she whispered, her heart soaring with hope. She followed the trail, her flashlight flickering as if protesting her decision. The whispers grew louder, but she tried to ignore them. They weren't real, she told herself. Just her mind playing tricks. And yet, the trees seemed to close in tighter, their twisted limbs forming grotesque shapes that resembled faces. One moment, she swore she saw eyes peering from the bark, the next, they were gone. Suddenly, her flashlight died. "Damn it," she hissed, slapping the side of the device. Darkness enveloped her like a smothering blanket. She fumbled for her phone, the faint glow of its screen her only salvation. She turned on its flashlight and froze. Standing a few feet away was a figure. It was small, childlike, but its proportions were off. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Toby," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure took a step forward, and she realized with growing horror that it wasn't her brother. Its eyes gleamed like molten silver, and its mouth stretched into a smile that was too wide, too sharp. "Elena," it said, in a voice that mimicked her own. She stumbled back, her phone slipping from her grasp. The light spun wildly before landing face down, plunging her into darkness once more. The whispers erupted around her, deafening and relentless. They spoke her name, Toby's name, and things she didn't understand but felt deep in her bones. Panic surged through her as she scrambled to her feet and ran blindly through the woods. Branches clawed at her arms and face, but she didn't stop. The whispers followed, growing louder, closer. She could feel them breathing down her neck, their icy breath sending chills through her body. And then, just as abruptly as they began, the whispers stopped. Elena halted, her chest heaving, and looked around. The forest was eerily silent again, the kind of silence that felt alive. She retrieved her phone, its screen cracked but still functional, and turned on the camera. "If anyone sees this," she said, her voice trembling, "don't come into these woods. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon." You might be the only ones who know what happened to me. She shone the phone's light around her, revealing something she hadn't noticed before. She was standing in a clearing, and at its center was a massive tree, its trunk blackened as if burned. Its branches stretched high into the sky, their tips disappearing into the darkness. Something about the tree drew her in, despite every fiber of her being screaming to run. She stepped closer, her feet moving of their own accord. As she approached, she saw carvings etched into the bark, symbols and faces that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. And then, she saw it. A small, familiar sneaker tangled in the roots. "Toby," she cried, rushing forward. But as she touched the tree, the ground beneath her gave way, and she was plunged into darkness. When she came to, she was no longer in the forest. Or at least, not the same forest. The trees were taller, their trunks impossibly thin, and their branches moved as if breathing. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the ground squelched beneath her feet. "Elena," the whispers called again, but this time they were accompanied by laughter. She spun around, trying to locate the source, but the forest seemed to shift and move, disorienting her. Then she saw him. Toby, standing just ahead, his back to her. "Toby," she cried, running toward him. But when she reached him, he turned, and she recoiled in horror. His eyes were hollow sockets, and his mouth moved, but it wasn't his voice that came out. "Stay," he said, in the voice of the thing she'd seen earlier. "You belong to the woods now." Elena's scream echoed through the forest, swallowed almost immediately by the shadows. When Ethan Brooks heard the sound of breaking glass, it was 2:47 a.m., and he was alone in his dark, sparsely furnished apartment. His heart skipped a beat. His left hand instinctively moved towards his nightstand, reaching for his Glock. He wasn't sure what had woken him, the glass breaking or the eerie feeling that someone had been watching him even before that. Years of working with Interpol's covert operations team had taught him to trust his instincts, and tonight, his instincts were screaming. Slowly, he got out of bed, eyes adjusting to the shadows in his room, every nerve in his body alert. He moved cautiously, rolling his feet along the hardwood to avoid creaking sounds as he approached the source of the noise. Through the door crack, he could see the vague outline of his shattered kitchen window and hear the faint sounds of movement. Two figures dressed in black were in his living room. Their features were masked, but the way they moved spoke volumes. They were trained. Special ops level, maybe even elite mercenaries. The fact that they were here, in his apartment in Paris, meant one thing: someone wanted him dead. Ethan couldn't afford to hesitate. Without another thought, he raised his Glock and took aim. A single muffled shot cracked through the silence as he squeezed the trigger. One of the figures dropped to the floor. The second intruder turned, but Ethan's shot was faster, and the man crumpled before he could retaliate. He didn't waste time investigating who they were. Instead, he scanned the room for anything they might have planted, any device or evidence left behind. But as he swept his gaze across the room, a shimmer caught his eye. There, on his table, was a sleek black envelope with an embossed symbol, a circle bisected by a lightning bolt. The insignia of the Black Lotus, a notorious shadow organization that had operated in the criminal underworld for decades. An organization he thought had been dismantled years ago. The implications hit him like a punch to the gut. Ethan remembered the last time he encountered them, in a mission that had nearly cost him his life. He'd been sent to recover sensitive intelligence on a biochemical weapon the group was rumored to have developed. Although he'd escaped with his life, the mission had ended in chaos, and Interpol's task force had suffered heavy casualties. The Black Lotus was no ordinary criminal syndicate, it operated with high-level support and military precision. Why would they want him now? And how had they even found him? He was officially dead, or at least that's what his file said. After the incident in Bolivia 2 years prior, Interpol had given him a new identity, wiping his records clean and placing him on permanent leave. Only a select few knew he was still alive. The envelope lay like a viper on his table, daring him to open it. He picked it up, feeling its surprising weight. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and when he unfolded it, his eyes fell on a short, chilling message: "Our past mistake will soon be corrected. Come to Rome if you want answers." He didn't need to think twice. The last time the Black Lotus had left a message like this, he'd lost 2 close friends. Rome, then. He'd be ready. The next evening, Ethan arrived in Rome, blending seamlessly into the bustling crowds that swarmed the city's ancient streets. The note had given no address, no meeting spot, just a city. But he knew they'd find him. He was barely 2 blocks from the Colosseum when he noticed a woman, tall and striking, following him from a distance. She kept her pace casual, but her gaze was intense. There was no mistaking her. She moved with the trained subtlety of an agent. Ethan ducked into a narrow alley and waited. Within seconds, she rounded the corner. He had his gun out, pressing it to her ribs before she could react. "Who sent you?" he whispered harshly, keeping his voice low. "The same people you're here to find," she replied without flinching, her voice steady. "But I'm not here to kill you." She pulled a crumpled envelope from her pocket and handed it to him. Keeping his eyes on her, he opened it. Inside was a single photograph, a grainy image of a small, glass vial with a green liquid inside. Beneath the photo was a simple instruction: find the vial, or the world dies. His mind raced. The Black Lotus's biochemical weapon. He thought it had been a myth, an exaggeration to keep people fearful. But if this photo was real, it meant the weapon was not only real but operational. The woman cleared her throat, her tone softening. "My name is Sofia Romano. I work with Interpol. I was undercover with Black Lotus for 2 years. They're going to use the vial, Ethan. This time, they're ready." "How do you know they won't just kill us both?" "They would have killed me if I hadn't escaped with this," she whispered, revealing a small data drive. "Everything I know is on here. They're going to release it in 3 days. We need to get this to Interpol, now." Ethan felt a chill sweep over him. "Where's the vial?" She hesitated. "Vienna. The headquarters of a pharmaceutical front company, BioCure. They plan to release it through their distribution network, infecting millions within days. Their mission was clear: intercept the weapon before the Black Lotus could unleash it." The next day, they were on a private flight to Vienna. Ethan tried not to let his thoughts drift to what would happen if they failed. The implications were terrifying. Sophia's intel indicated that the weaponized virus could trigger a mass pandemic with a nearly 100% fatality rate. If released, humanity itself would hang in the balance. As their plane landed in Vienna, the sense of urgency became overwhelming. They had a narrow window of opportunity, and BioCure's headquarters was as fortified as a military base. They rented a car and drove in silence, each lost in thoughts about what lay ahead. The plan was deceptively simple: they would infiltrate the BioCure building under the guise of employees and locate the vial. That night, dressed in the stolen uniforms of BioCure lab technicians, they slipped into the building. Every step through the sterile corridors made Ethan's heart pound faster. The facility was eerily quiet, with surveillance cameras rotating mechanically above them, reminding them they were on borrowed time. Finally, they reached the lab. Through the glass walls, they saw it, the vial, resting inside a containment unit. They were close, but before Ethan could reach the containment unit, a voice echoed over the intercom. "Well done, Ethan. I see your instincts haven't dulled." The voice was smooth and chillingly familiar: Lucian Keller, head of the Black Lotus. "But did you really think I'd leave my prize unguarded?" As the last word left his lips, the room flooded with armed guards. Ethan and Sophia pressed their backs against each other, outnumbered but resolute. "Any last words?" Keller taunted over the intercom, clearly savoring his supposed victory. But Ethan had one last trick. He pulled a small, cylindrical device from his pocket and threw it toward the guards. A bright flash and a deafening bang disoriented them, buying him and Sophia the few seconds they needed. They leapt toward the vial, securing it and racing toward the exit as alarms blared throughout the facility. But their escape wouldn't be that easy. Keller's men pursued them relentlessly through the corridors, gunfire echoing through the building. They fought back, but ammunition was running low, and they could hear footsteps closing in. Outside, they sprinted for the car, every step feeling heavier as Keller's men gained ground. Finally, they reached the vehicle and sped away, Keller's guards close behind in pursuit. With the BioCure vials secured, they hurtled toward the airport. Just when they thought they might have escaped, one of Keller's SUVs rammed their car. Ethan struggled to keep control, veering toward the airport entrance. Sophia clutched the vial tightly, her knuckles white. Then, in a final desperate move, they managed to shake the last SUV just as they reached the terminal. They boarded a departing plane, the vials safely tucked away. Only once they were airborne did the magnitude of what they had achieved settle in. They had saved millions, and although the threat of the Black Lotus still loomed, they had dealt them a significant blow. As the sun rose, Ethan leaned back, allowing himself a rare moment of relief. But he knew better than anyone that in his line of work, peace was always temporary. The night began like any other for Mark Phelps, head of security at the Ravenswood Asylum. Perched on the hill, towering over the sleepy town below, the asylum had a grim reputation. Tales of inhumane treatment and experiments were whispered among locals, but no one dared investigate. The institution had been shut down a decade ago, and the patients relocated, but the asylum was still owned by some obscure medical corporation that insisted on keeping a skeleton staff and tight security around the building. Mark knew very little about the details and didn't ask questions. He needed the paycheck, and the less he knew, the better he slept. Tonight, though, something felt different. The air was colder than usual, crisp and biting, cutting through his thick jacket as he walked through the dim hallways with his flashlight. Every creak of the floors, every groan of the old pipes seemed to echo twice as loud. He glanced at his watch, 2:03 a.m. Only 4 hours until his shift was over. But time seemed to drag in this place, stretching like the long, dark corridors lined with rooms he'd never dared explore alone. Mark's footsteps echoed as he made his way to the main security room, located deep within the asylum's heart. Screens lined the wall, each showing a different section of the asylum in black and white night vision. Mark noted the static on a few screens. As usual, aging wiring and minimal maintenance meant parts of the asylum were dead zones. That made it almost impossible to cover every part of the massive, dilapidated building, but he had gotten used to the blind spots. As he sipped his coffee and checked his rounds on the monitors, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Room 39 on the east wing, one of the dead zones. He squinted, unsure if he'd actually seen something or if his mind was playing tricks on him. But then, there it was again. A shadow, barely visible on the edge of the screen, slipping out of view. It was impossible. The asylum was closed off to the public, and the doors were locked every night. But there it was, undeniable and hauntingly real. He grabbed his flashlight, adjusted his utility belt, and headed down the east wing, his heart pounding harder with each step. The air grew colder as he walked, his breath visible in front of him as he exhaled. It was like the building itself was breathing, the walls alive with a sinister energy that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Is anyone there?" he called, his voice echoing down the empty hallway. Silence. But then, he heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping. Like fingers drumming on metal. He shone his flashlight down the hallway and saw a door slightly ajar, room 39. The tapping stopped as soon as he pointed his flashlight toward it. He took a deep breath, stepped forward, and slowly pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dark and filled with a sickly, musty smell that made his stomach turn. The flashlight beam landed on an old metal chair bolted to the floor in the center of the room, shackles hanging from its arms and legs, rusted with age. On the far wall, strange symbols were scratched into the peeling paint, forming some kind of ritualistic pattern. But what made his blood run cold was the figure sitting in the chair. It was a man, at least, it looked like one. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale and tight over his skull, like he hadn't eaten in weeks. His mouth hung open in a silent scream, and dark circles marked his sunken eyes. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as the man's head slowly turned, his lifeless eyes locking onto him. "Help, me!" the man whispered, his voice raspy and weak. Mark took a step back, his mind racing. The asylum was supposed to be empty. No one was supposed to be here. But as he stumbled backward, he felt something brush against his shoulder, something cold and clammy. He spun around, but there was nothing there, just shadows. The cold grew more intense, and the air seemed to thicken, pressing in on him like an invisible weight. He could feel something watching him, something hidden in the darkness, lurking just beyond the reach of his flashlight. In the distance, a low moaning sound echoed through the halls, like a chorus of voices in pain. Mark forced himself to breathe, his chest tight with fear. He backed out of room 39, his hands shaking as he shut the door. He turned and ran, heart hammering, but as he turned a corner, he came face to face with a familiar face, a fellow security guard, Sean. "Mark, what the hell are you doing down here?" Sean asked, his brow furrowed. "There's someone, in room 39, Mark stammered, still catching his breath. Sean's face went pale. "Room 39? Mark, there's no room 39 on the East Wing. They sealed that area years ago." Mark blinked, trying to make sense of what Sean was saying. He knew he'd seen it. The room, the symbols, the man chained to the chair, he'd been right there. He shook his head, trying to clear the images from his mind. "Sean, I saw it. I swear." But Sean only looked at him with a mix of pity and fear. "Listen, let's get back to the security room. Maybe it's just the night shift getting to you." Reluctantly, Mark followed Sean back through the winding corridors. But as they reached the security room, he noticed something strange. Every screen was flickering, static filling the monitors. One by one, the screens went black, until only one remained, showing a live feed of room 39. In the center of the room, where Mark had just seen the man, now stood a tall figure cloaked in shadow. Its head tilted to one side as if listening, aware of being watched. It raised one skeletal finger and pointed directly at the camera. Directly at Mark. That's not possible," Sean whispered, frozen in fear beside him. The figure on the screen took a step closer to the camera, and then another. It kept moving forward, as if approaching the very edge of the screen, until all that filled the monitor was darkness. The lights flickered in the security room, and the temperature dropped even further. Both men were rooted to the spot, terror paralyzing them. Then, a faint scratching sound started from behind them, soft and methodical, growing louder, scraping against the metal door. "Do you hear that?" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. Sean nodded, his eyes wide with fear. The door began to shake, as if something on the other side was trying to get in. Mark reached for his radio, desperate for help, but all he heard was static. The scratching became more frantic, more desperate, and then, with a loud crash, the door flew open. The figure stood in the doorway, its face a hollow void, eyes like black pits, empty yet somehow alive with malice. It glided forward, unaffected by gravity, closing in on them as they backed away. The lights flickered violently, casting wild shadows across the walls. Mark raised his flashlight, but the beam barely illuminated its face, a skeletal grin, teeth yellowed and sharp, eyes empty yet somehow watching him. It reached out a bony hand, its fingers curling like claws, and Mark felt an icy grip close around his throat. He gasped, struggling, but his voice failed him. Darkness swam at the edge of his vision as he fought for air. Sean screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the thick, oppressive silence that filled the room. In a final, desperate attempt, Mark reached for the emergency alarm button on his belt and pressed it. A loud, blaring siren filled the asylum, echoing down the empty corridors. But the figure didn't flinch, it only tightened its grip, pulling him closer, its face mere inches from his. "Mark." It whispered, its voice like nails scraping across metal. And then, everything went black. The town of Hollow's End had always been shrouded in mystery. Settled at the edge of a dense forest and bordered by the mist-laden Greywater Lake, Hollow's End was one of those forgotten places, a town of cracked cobblestone roads and crumbling buildings. The residents were few, all hiding behind locked doors and drawn curtains, as if the forest itself harbored secrets too dark to confront. But tonight, Hollow's End felt even more still, as though something primal lay waiting. As rain began to pour down in thick sheets, drenching the town, a group of 5 people huddled near the old, decaying church at the center of Hollow's End. This wasn't any ordinary group. They were specialists, mercenaries, really, who had been called to the town with a specific purpose: hunt down a presence that had been terrorizing the outskirts, something that defied human understanding. Their leader, Jackson Tate, a rugged man with a scar running down his left cheek, glanced at his wristwatch and grimaced as lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the graveyard that spread out before them. "We're wasting time," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the sound of thunder. Beside him was Elena, an ex-military sharpshooter with a no-nonsense attitude, her gaze sharp as she scanned the horizon. "Jackson, I'm telling you, the townsfolk won't talk for a reason. This thing, whatever it is, has been lurking here for decades. Nobody wants to admit it's real." A nervous chuckle broke out from James, the team's tech specialist, as he checked his equipment. "So, we're just supposed to walk in and hunt a ghost?" Jackson shot him a withering look. "We're here to do a job. We're here because this thing, whatever it is, has claimed 4 lives in the last month. All we know is, it comes from the forest. People hear voices, footsteps. Those who try to follow them end up, gone." They fell silent. Even with the thunderstorm raging, the silence in the air felt thick, oppressive. The forest loomed in the distance, shrouded in fog, each tree a gnarled and twisted specter against the dark sky. "Let's move," Jackson ordered, breaking the tension. They turned on their flashlights, beams cutting through the thick mist as they made their way toward the forest's edge. Every step felt heavy, each footfall sinking slightly into the sodden earth, and the smell of wet leaves and decay hung in the air. As they entered the forest, the trees seemed to close in around them. Shadows twisted in unnatural ways, stretching and curling, taking forms that almost looked like hands reaching out, like faces peering from the dark. Their flashlights flickered. "This forest feels alive," murmured Oliver, the youngest of the group, a rookie with bright eyes but trembling hands. "Like it's watching us." Elena scoffed. "Get a grip, rookie. Forests can't watch." But even she couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, like invisible eyes were following their every move. The group continued forward, carefully navigating the uneven terrain, the silence broken only by the sound of their boots squelching in the mud. Suddenly, a whisper cut through the night, faint and chilling. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from, but it echoed, carrying an unnatural resonance. They all froze, exchanging nervous glances. "Did anyone else hear that?" James whispered, his voice shaking. Jackson nodded grimly, his jaw set. "Stay close. Don't stray off the path." The whisper came again, louder this time, and Jackson felt a chill run down his spine. It was a voice, soft and distant, speaking a language he didn't recognize, an ancient and guttural tongue that felt wrong, like it was never meant to be heard by human ears. The whisper grew, spreading through the air like a virus, as though the entire forest had come alive with voices, each branch, each leaf murmuring that same haunting chant. The air grew colder, and Jackson could see his breath misting before him. And then, the voice stopped. The sudden silence was even more unnerving. The team looked at each other, fear in their eyes, but they were too far in to turn back. Jackson gestured for them to continue. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, the forest seeming to warp and twist around them, paths doubling back on themselves, trees appearing to close in. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with mist, swirling around their legs like tendrils. Then, out of nowhere, they heard a scream, a blood-curdling, agonized cry that echoed through the trees. It was close, too close. The team swung their flashlights in all directions, but the mist obscured their view. "Everyone stay sharp," Jackson barked. That scream, it could be one of the missing. As they pushed forward, the mist began to thin, revealing an old, decrepit cabin hidden in a clearing. It looked ancient, with walls of rotting wood and windows that seemed like dark, empty eyes staring out at them. The door hung open, creaking softly in the breeze. Without a word, Jackson approached the cabin, motioning for the others to follow. They moved as one, flashlights raised, weapons ready. As they entered the cabin, the air inside was thick with the smell of decay, a sweet, sickly odor that made their stomachs churn. The walls were covered in strange symbols, scrawled in what looked like dried blood. They were unlike anything Jackson had ever seen, twisting and writhing like they were alive. The cabin felt wrong, like it was a wound in the fabric of reality, a place that defied the natural order. In the corner of the room was a wooden trapdoor, partially open, leading down into darkness. Jackson glanced at the others, a silent question in his eyes. Elena nodded, her face pale but determined. They had come this far, they couldn't turn back now. He opened the trapdoor fully, revealing a set of narrow, winding stairs leading down into a black void. The air that rose from below was cold and smelled of earth and rot. Taking a deep breath, Jackson descended, his flashlight barely piercing the darkness. The stairs seemed to go on forever, twisting and spiraling down into the earth. The further they went, the colder it got, until their breath was coming out in white clouds. The walls were damp, covered in some kind of fungus that glowed faintly in the dark, casting an eerie, sickly green light. Finally, they reached the bottom, stepping into a vast, cavernous chamber. The walls were lined with more of those strange symbols, pulsating softly as if they were alive. In the center of the chamber was an altar, and on it lay something that made their blood run cold. A body, or at least what was left of one. It was shriveled, like all the life had been sucked out of it, the skin tight against the bones, the eyes sunken and hollow. But even more horrifying were the tendrils of darkness that seemed to writhe and pulse around it, tendrils that moved with a life of their own. "What is that?" Oliver whispered, his voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, the shadows around the body began to shift, coalescing into a form, a figure of pure darkness, towering over them, its eyes like pits of infinite blackness. The air grew impossibly cold, and a deep, rumbling voice filled the chamber, reverberating through their bones. "You should not have come here." The voice was ancient, carrying the weight of centuries, and as it spoke, the darkness seemed to grow, spreading across the chamber like a living thing, creeping toward them with a malevolent hunger. "Back, everyone, back!" Jackson shouted, but it was too late. The shadow figure lunged, its arms extending like tendrils, wrapping around Elena and lifting her off the ground. She screamed, struggling, but the tendrils tightened, drawing her closer to the dark form. Her flashlight fell from her hand, rolling across the ground as the others watched in horror. Jackson raised his gun, firing at the creature, but the bullets passed through it, vanishing into the darkness as if they'd never existed. The shadow laughed, a deep, guttural sound that echoed in the cavern, filling them with a dread they'd never known. "Run!" Jackson yelled, grabbing Oliver by the arm as they sprinted back toward the stairs. James was right behind them, but as they reached the base of the stairs, they realized that the entrance had vanished. The stairs led to a solid wall of stone, sealing them in. Panic set in as they searched for a way out, but the darkness was closing in, surrounding them on all sides, the whispers growing louder and louder, filling their minds with thoughts that weren't their own. And in that moment, they knew, they were not leaving Hollow's End alive. They called it the Crimson House. Not because of its color, no, the house was a dull, faded gray, with paint peeling from the walls and windows clouded by grime. It earned its name because of the horrors that supposedly took place there. Over a century ago, Dr. Cornelius Whitaker, a reclusive and enigmatic doctor, had lived there, conducting experiments on his patients. The townsfolk said they could still hear their cries of anguish on windless nights, like echoes trapped within the walls. For years, no one dared approach the place. It was left to rot at the edge of town, overgrown by weeds and hidden by thick, thorny bushes. But legends persisted, and people were drawn to the mystery. Some braver souls ventured to the house, hoping to disprove the stories or to catch a glimpse of something otherworldly. None of them ever spoke of what they found, if they ever found anything at all. And over time, the house was largely forgotten. But for Emily and her friends, it wasn't forgotten at all. They had grown up hearing the stories of the Crimson House, sharing ghost tales around campfires, daring each other to walk to its gates. Now, as college students back home for the summer, they wanted one last thrill before they parted ways again. Emily's friend, Jake, suggested they go to the house at midnight, just to see if the legends were true. "You all are chicken if you don't go," he taunted, smirking at them as they stood in the field outside the town. They had gathered there just as the sun began to set, the horizon turning blood red. The Crimson House loomed in the distance, a silent silhouette against the darkening sky. "I'm in," Emily replied, feeling a mix of fear and excitement. She had always been the skeptical one, the voice of reason in their group. But something about the house called to her, a chance to face her childhood fears head-on, maybe prove to herself that she could conquer anything. The others hesitated, exchanging nervous glances, but eventually, they all agreed. There were 6 of them: Emily, Jake, Sophie, Matt, Claire, and Brian. Armed with flashlights, they made their way through the overgrown field, pushing aside branches and wading through knee-high grass, until they reached the rusty iron gate that marked the entrance to the Crimson House. As they stepped through the gate, a chill swept over them, colder than the night air. The house loomed above them, its windows dark and foreboding, like empty eye sockets. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. "Last chance to turn back," Matt joked, though his voice trembled. "Too late for that," Jake replied, grinning as he pushed open the door, which swung inward with a loud groan. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something else, something metallic. They shone their flashlights around, revealing a grand foyer filled with dust and cobwebs. A large staircase spiraled up to the second floor, its banister coated with grime. "Let's split up," Jake said, clearly trying to sound brave. "Cover more ground." "Are you out of your mind?" Claire whispered, clutching her flashlight tightly. "That's exactly how people die in horror movies." Jake rolled his eyes. "Fine, we'll stick together. But don't chicken out on me." They moved deeper into the house, their footsteps echoing on the creaky wooden floor. Every shadow seemed to shift, every creak of the old house sounded like a distant whisper. The walls were lined with faded portraits of grim-faced people, their eyes seeming to follow them as they moved. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine as they passed a particularly large portrait of a man with piercing eyes and a thin, cruel mouth. She recognized him from the legends, Dr. Cornelius Whitaker. The further they went, the colder it got. They reached the living room, a vast, cavernous space filled with old furniture covered in dusty sheets. A grand piano stood in the corner, its keys yellowed with age. As they passed, Emily swore she heard a faint note, like someone had brushed against the keys, but no one else seemed to notice. They explored in silence, their flashlights sweeping over forgotten furniture and decaying wallpaper. Just as they reached the dining room, Sophie stopped suddenly, shining her flashlight on the wall. Her eyes widened. "What is that?" she whispered. The others turned to look. There, scrawled across the walls in a dark, reddish-brown stain, were words, dozens of them, sentences that overlapped and twisted around each other, like a madman's ravings. "I can hear them. They won't stop. The voices won't stop. Is that blood?" Brian whispered, his face pale. Jake laughed nervously. "It's just paint. Probably some prank from the last people who were here." But Emily wasn't so sure. She couldn't shake the feeling that the words were real, that they were a message, a warning from someone who had been trapped here, driven mad by whatever haunted this place. "Let's keep moving," she said, her voice barely audible. She didn't want to be in that room any longer. They moved to the hallway, where they found a door at the end that led to the basement. The smell of rot was stronger here, filling the air with a sickly, metallic tang. "Come on, let's check it out," Jake said, opening the door and shining his flashlight down the stairs. Emily hesitated. Everything in her screamed to turn back, to leave the house and never look back. But she didn't want to be the one to back out, not after coming this far. They descended the stairs, their footsteps echoing on the stone steps. The basement was pitch black, their flashlights barely illuminating the room. There were strange, rusted metal tables in the center of the room, each one covered in dark stains. Chains hung from the walls, clinking softly as if moved by an invisible breeze. This doesn't feel right," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. And then they heard it, a soft, scratching sound, like nails scraping against stone. It was coming from the far corner of the basement, where the shadows were thickest. "Who's there?" Jake called, his voice wavering. He took a step forward, raising his flashlight. The beam landed on a figure crouched in the corner, its back to them. It was thin and hunched, with skin stretched tight over its bones. The figure rocked back and forth, muttering to itself in a low, frantic voice. "Hey!" Jake shouted, his voice louder this time. The figure stopped, its head turning slowly to face them. Emily felt her blood turn to ice as she saw its face, a gaunt, hollow-eyed skull with skin that looked like it had been stretched over it. The eyes were black pits, staring straight at her, and its mouth opened in a silent scream, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. The figure lunged forward, moving with unnatural speed, its bony hands reaching out. The group scattered, stumbling backward as the figure let out a guttural, otherworldly scream that echoed through the basement, filling their minds with a terror unlike anything they had ever felt. "Run!" Emily screamed, grabbing Sophie's arm and pulling her toward the stairs. They stumbled up the steps, their hearts pounding as the sound of that horrifying scream chased them up. Behind them, they could hear the heavy, labored breaths of the figure, its footsteps close, so close. They burst into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind them, but the screaming didn't stop. It reverberated through the house, filling every room, every hallway, as though the walls themselves were screaming with it. "We need to get out of here," Matt shouted, panic etched into his face. They ran toward the front door, but as they reached it, the door slammed shut, the locks clicking into place with a force that shook the walls. The windows darkened, as if an unseen hand had covered them, blocking out the faint light of the moon. The house was alive. Desperate, they ran through the rooms, searching for any exit, but every door they tried was locked, every window unbreakable. The figure's screams echoed through the house, growing louder, more desperate, and they could hear it moving through the rooms, searching for them, hunting them. In the chaos, they became separated. Emily found herself alone, her flashlight flickering as she stumbled through the dark, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She could feel the house closing in on her, its walls pulsing with a dark, malevolent energy. Then, just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, she heard a voice, soft and gentle, cutting through the darkness. "Emily." She froze, her heart pounding. It was her mother's voice. But that was impossible, her mother had died years ago. "Emily. Come to me." The voice was calling from upstairs, echoing down the dark corridor. Emily's legs moved on their own, as if compelled by some unseen force, drawing her up the stairs toward the voice. She walked in a trance, her flashlight flickering as she moved through the darkened halls, the walls seeming to close in around her. As she reached the top of the stairs, the voice stopped, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like the entire world had ceased to exist. And then, from the shadows, the figure emerged, its hollow eyes staring into hers. It reached out, its bony fingers brushing her face, and she felt a cold unlike anything she had ever known, a darkness that seeped into her very soul. And in that moment, she knew, the house had claimed her. The rain fell in relentless sheets over the neon-lit streets of Silver City, casting an almost ethereal glow that distorted the shapes of people, cars, and buildings alike. Through the haze and the glowing signs, a lone figure moved with purpose, blending in with the shadows yet keenly aware of every sound, every shift in the urban landscape. That figure was Jace Ramirez, a former Special Forces operative turned private investigator, haunted by a past that wouldn't let him go. Jace's life had spiraled into a chaotic blend of half-forgotten memories and sleepless nights since his last mission, a mission that had gone disastrously wrong. He had lost most of his team, but what haunted him most wasn't their deaths, it was the man responsible. A man he was here to find tonight. Rumor had it that his target, Viktor Volkov, had resurfaced in Silver City, allegedly plotting something big and devastating. Jace's old friend, Detective Harris, had tipped him off, his voice tinged with an urgency Jace had rarely heard. Harris, a seasoned detective in Silver City's police department, had been tracking Volkov's movements for months, and the information he provided was always valuable, albeit sometimes cryptic. The glowing sign above Jace read, "Trenton Hotel," though the lights flickered as if ready to give out any moment, much like the hotel itself. Abandoned years ago, the once luxurious building had turned into a hiding place for criminals, squatters, and other souls who preferred to stay out of sight. The roof leaked, graffiti marked the crumbling walls, and a chill seemed to hang in the air, even more bitter on a night like this. Jace exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold, damp air. He checked the Glock strapped securely under his worn leather jacket, feeling its familiar weight and comfort. While many things in his life were unpredictable, this gun was a constant, a tool, a weapon, and sometimes, a lifeline. According to Harris's tip, Volkov was meeting someone tonight, a man known only as, the Broker. Jace had encountered the name before, it was whispered among criminals, a shadowy figure rumored to orchestrate and fund operations from the darkest corners of the underworld. Anyone who had a score to settle or a need for cash would turn to the Broker, provided they had the connections and the nerve. Jace crouched in the shadows across the street, waiting, watching. Every few minutes, he could see movement through the hotel's broken windows. Then, at exactly 11 o'clock, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows offering no glimpse of the occupant inside. The door opened, and a man stepped out, his face concealed beneath a dark hat and coat. Jace knew it had to be Volkov. Silently, he crossed the rain-soaked street, careful to stay hidden. He entered the hotel through a side entrance, slipping into the darkness and closing the door behind him. The interior was even worse than he'd imagined, walls covered in peeling wallpaper, floors littered with broken glass and trash. It smelled like mold and something else he couldn't quite place. But Jace wasn't here for ambience. The faint hum of voices floated from deeper within the hotel. Jace's pulse quickened. He recognized Volkov's voice, a deep, accented murmur tinged with impatience, and the Broker's calm, icy tone that could chill even the bravest of souls. They were talking business, something about final preparations and ensuring Ramirez doesn't leave here alive. The Broker's voice was almost mechanical, like a surgeon explaining a delicate procedure. There was no anger, no emotion, just a detached calculation that unnerved Jace more than Volkov's open hostility. "You'll receive the final payment once the job is done," the broker was saying, his tone as smooth as silk. "But if he interferes, end him." "I don't care how." Volkov's laughter echoed down the hallway. "Trust me, he won't make it out. Ramirez is already a dead man." Jace's hands tightened into fists. He had known that tonight was a trap, yet he couldn't resist the chance to face Volkov. There was no turning back now. He pressed forward, sticking to the shadows, but his silent approach was abruptly interrupted. A heavy hand suddenly clamped down on his shoulder, shoving him hard against the wall. He didn't have time to react as a burly figure loomed over him, a bodyguard, judging by his size and the determined scowl on his face. Jace twisted, breaking free with practiced precision and driving his elbow into the man's gut. The bodyguard grunted, staggering back, but Jace was already a step ahead. He brought his knee up sharply, hitting the man in the stomach before landing a swift, powerful strike to his jaw. The guard dropped to the floor, unconscious. But the noise had given him away. The murmur of voices stopped. A silence stretched, heavy and expectant, until Volkov's voice rang out. "Ramirez." Volkov called, his voice laced with mockery and a touch of anger. "Did you really think you could sneak up on me?" A shot rang out, the bullet narrowly missing Jace's head. He ducked and rolled, firing back instinctively, though he knew he was outmatched. Volkov was armed, and more than likely, he had backup on the way. Jace felt the pressure building, the need for a plan intensifying with each heartbeat. He'd faced worse odds before, but he couldn't help the nagging feeling that tonight was different. Volkov and the broker weren't just random criminals, they were part of something much bigger, something calculated and ruthless. As Volkov's men closed in, Jace weighed his options. The main hallway was out, too open. He scanned the surroundings quickly and noticed an old ventilation shaft partially concealed by debris. It was risky, but it could give him an edge. He darted toward the shaft, pulling himself inside just as bullets peppered the wall behind him. The cramped space forced him to move slowly, every inch forward demanding focus and discipline. He could hear Volkov's curses and the broker's cold reprimand echoing through the walls, their voices a twisted reminder of how close he was to being cornered. Finally, he emerged from the shaft, dropping down into what appeared to be an old ballroom. Dust hung heavy in the air, and shattered chandeliers dangled precariously from the ceiling. Jace surveyed the room, his instincts on high alert. This room was a dead end. He'd either have to make his stand here or find another escape route. He was scanning the walls when a figure appeared from the shadows. Detective Harris. For a moment, Jace felt a flicker of relief. Harris was one of the few people he could trust, or so he'd thought. "Harris?" Jace asked, lowering his gun slightly, though his gaze remained wary. "What are you doing here?" Harris looked worn and anxious, a stark contrast to his usual calm demeanor. "I tried to warn you, Jace," he said, his voice thick with regret. "Volkov, he has my family. I didn't have a choice." Jace's pulse quickened, anger mixing with disbelief. "So you led me here? You betrayed me." Harris flinched, but he didn't deny it. "I had no other option, Jace. They said they'd kill my wife, my daughter. I had to play along." Jace's mind raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. Harris might have betrayed him, but he was still in danger. If Volkov was willing to threaten an innocent family, there was no limit to his ruthlessness. Before he could respond, heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway. Volkov's men were closing in fast, and Jace knew they had only seconds before the entire room was swarming with armed thugs. "Listen," Jace said, his voice low and intense, "we don't have time for apologies. If we're going to make it out of here, we need to work together." Harris nodded, and they both turned toward the old staircase that led to the roof. It was a long shot, but with Volkov's men approaching, it was the only option left. They sprinted up the staircase, their footsteps echoing against the crumbling walls. Behind them, Volkov's voice rang out, taunting them. "Ramirez! You can't run forever. This is your end." Jace didn't respond, focusing instead on reaching the rooftop. As they burst through the final door, they found themselves standing on the edge of the building, the city stretching out before them, its lights dim beneath the stormy sky. A helicopter hovered overhead, its spotlight cutting through the rain and illuminating the rooftop. Police sirens wailed in the distance, but Jace knew they wouldn't arrive in time. Volkov appeared in the doorway, his gun trained on Jace, a cold smile twisting his lips. "This is where it ends, Ramirez. You should have stayed dead the first time." Jace felt Harris tense beside him, but he held his ground, staring Volkov down. "You've taken a lot from me, Volkov. But you won't walk away from this." Volkov's smile widened. Bold words from a man who's about to die. But before he could pull the trigger, the sound of a gunshot filled the air. Harris staggered, clutching his chest as he fell to the ground, his eyes wide with